I sat in my kitchen that morning, reading and rereading those accusations, and I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. How could they possibly claim that my family's land belonged to them? I had the deed. I had the surveys. I had generations of tax records. But then I remembered what Helen Vaughn had said about discrepancies in property documentation, and a cold fear started growing in my chest. I drove to the county courthouse that afternoon and requested copies of all property records related to my land and the Lakewood Meadows development. What I found there made my worst fears seem like pleasant daydreams. According to the official records on file, the property boundaries for Lakewood Meadows extended much further than I'd realized. In fact, their survey showed Crystal Lake and the surrounding area as being within their development boundaries. But that was impossible. I'd seen the original homestead papers. I'd seen my great-grandfather's hand-drawn property map. Crystal Lake had always been part of the Mitchell Ranch. That's when I noticed something strange about the dates on the Lakewood Meadows survey. It was dated 3 months before my grandmother had passed away, but it referenced property transfers and boundary adjustments that supposedly happened after her death. Someone had been playing games with the official records, and they'd been planning this takeover long before I'd even inherited the ranch. I drove home that evening feeling like I was drowning. How do you fight people who are willing to falsify government records? How do you prove ownership of land that's been in your family for a century when someone has the power to change the documentation? That night, I did something I probably should have done 3 years earlier when I'd first inherited the property. I went up to my grandmother's attic and started going through all her old papers, looking for anything that might help me understand what was happening. Grandma Rose had been a pack rat when it came to family documents. There were boxes and boxes of papers, old letters, receipts, newspaper clippings, legal documents, photographs. I'd been putting off dealing with it all because it felt too overwhelming, too final. It was an old wooden cigar box, hidden beneath a stack of Christmas decorations in the far corner of the attic. The wood was dark with age, and the brass hinges creaked when I opened it. Inside was a collection of documents I'd never seen before, wrapped in oiled cloth like they were precious artifacts. The first document took my breath away. It was the original homestead certificate for the Mitchell Ranch, signed by my great-grandfather in 1923 and officially recorded with the territorial government. But it wasn't just the land grant I'd expected to find. This document included mineral and water rights to the entire property, including specific mention of the natural spring-fed lake located in the northwest quarter section. It also included detailed boundary descriptions that extended the ranch property nearly a quarter mile beyond what I'd thought were our borders. According to this document, not only was Crystal Lake definitely part of the Mitchell Ranch, but a significant portion of what was now the Lakewood Meadows development was actually built on land that still legally belonged to me. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. Underneath the homestead certificate was a folder containing correspondence between my grandmother and various lawyers dating back 15 years. As I read through the letters, a picture began to emerge of a legal battle I'd never known about. Apparently, there had been multiple attempts over the years by different developers to purchase or claim parts of the ranch property. Each time, Grandma Rose had fought them off with the help of a lawyer named Thomas Fitzgerald. According to his letters, she'd been particularly concerned about protecting the water rights to Crystal Lake and had taken specific legal steps to ensure they could never be challenged. The most recent correspondence was dated just 6 months before Grandma Rose had passed away. In it, Mr. Fitzgerald was warning her about aggressive inquiries regarding the ranch property from a development company called Meadowbrook Holdings. I'd never heard of Meadowbrook Holdings, but a quick internet search revealed that it was the parent company that had developed Lakewood Meadows. They'd been planning this for years, probably waiting for my grandmother to pass away so they could move against a younger, less experienced heir. But Grandma Rose had been too smart for them. At the bottom of the cigar box was one final document that made me cry when I read it. It was a letter addressed to me in my grandmother's careful handwriting. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found yourself in some kind of trouble regarding the ranch. I've been expecting this day for many years, which is why I've prepared these documents for you. There are people who believe that money and lawyers can take anything they want, but they don't understand what it means to have 4 generations of your family's blood and sweat in the soil. This land isn't just property, sweetheart. It's your heritage, and it's worth fighting for. Everything you need to prove your ownership is in this box. But more than that, you need to know that you have allies you haven't met yet. Thomas Fitzgerald's son, Michael, has taken over his father's practice, and he's been waiting to hear from you. There's also something else you need to know about Crystal Lake that will surprise these developers. Trust the land, trust the law, and trust yourself. The Mitchell women have been fighting for what's ours for 100 years, and we've never lost yet. All my love, Grandma Rose. P.S. Check the old survey markers around the lake. You'll find some interesting surprises. I spent the rest of that night reading every document in the box, and by morning, I understood exactly what Grandma Rose had done and why she'd been so confident that the ranch would be protected. The next morning, I called Michael Fitzgerald. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, when I identified myself, "I've been wondering when I'd hear from you. My father spoke of your grandmother often, and I know he'd be pleased to know you're ready to fight." Michael was nothing like the slick corporate lawyers Margaret had brought to my door. He was maybe 40 years old, with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested he understood the value of honest work. When he came to the ranch that afternoon, the first thing he did was ask to see Crystal Lake. "Your grandmother was right to be concerned about the water rights," he told me as we walked down to the shore. "In this state, water rights are often more valuable than the land itself, and she made sure yours were bulletproof." He pointed to a series of old wooden posts around the lake that I'd never really noticed before. "Those are the original survey markers from 1923. See how they're positioned? This lake and everything within 50 feet of the high water mark belongs to you, period. No question, no legal challenges possible. But the county records show a fraudulent survey," Michael interrupted. "And filing a fraudulent survey is a felony. Margaret and her friends have been very busy, but they made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" Michael smiled. "They assumed your grandmother was just an old lady who didn't understand property law. What they didn't know is that she spent 15 years preparing for this exact situation. Every document in that cigar box has been verified and registered with 3 different government agencies. Your property boundaries, your water rights, your mineral rights, they're all protected by legal instruments that can't be altered or challenged. So what do? We file criminal charges for fraud, and we sue them for every penny they've spent building on your land." That's when I learned the most shocking fact of all. According to the original survey documents, Crystal Lake wasn't just on Mitchell Ranch property. The Lakewood Meadows Community Clubhouse, their main swimming pool, their tennis courts, and 6 of their luxury homes were all built on land that legally belonged to me. Margaret hadn't been trying to steal my property. She'd been trying to cover up the fact that they'd already stolen it. But the discovery that would ultimately bring them down was still waiting for us at the bottom of Crystal Lake, and neither Michael nor I could have predicted what we'd find when we followed Grandma Rose's final clue. The confrontation that would determine the fate of everything began not in a courtroom, but at an emergency meeting of the Lakewood Meadows Homeowners Association on a bitter December evening. Michael had spent 2 weeks building our case, and what he'd uncovered was enough to not only prove my ownership of the disputed land, but to potentially send Margaret and her accomplices to prison for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. But before we could file our lawsuit, Margaret made one final desperate attempt to silence me. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, hand-delivered by Richard Blackwood himself. This time, there were no pleasantries or fake smiles. The message was simple and direct. If I didn't accept their buyout offer by Monday morning, they would file a lawsuit claiming that I had damaged their property values and caused emotional distress to their community members. They were seeking $2 million in damages. It was a bluff, but it was designed to scare me into settlement before I could expose what they'd done. Instead, it made me angry. I called Michael immediately. They want to play hardball? Let's play. That evening, we drove to the Lakewood Meadows Community Center, where the HOA was holding their emergency meeting. According to the agenda posted at their front gate, they were discussing security measures to address ongoing property disputes with neighboring landowners. What they were actually doing was trying to figure out how to eliminate me as a problem before I could destroy them all. Michael and I arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, just as the meeting was beginning. The community center was packed, probably 50 residents, all looking worried and confused about why they'd been called to an emergency session. Margaret was at the front of the room, standing behind a podium like she was delivering a State of the Union address. When she saw us walk in, her face went white. "This is a private meeting for Lakewood Meadows residents only," she announced. Michael smiled and pulled out a folder. "Actually, Mrs. Hensley, this meeting is being held on property that belongs to my client, so we have every right to be here." A murmur went through the crowd. Several people turned to look at us, clearly confused about what was happening. Margaret tried to maintain control. "That's ridiculous. This community center was built on Lakewood Meadows property, paid for by HOA fees, and built without proper permits on land that was illegally surveyed," Michael interrupted. "Would you like me to explain to your residents how you've been stealing from them? Or would you prefer to do it yourself?" That's when Margaret made the mistake that sealed her fate. Instead of trying to de-escalate or negotiate, she doubled down on the lies. "Ladies and gentlemen," she addressed the crowd, "what you're witnessing is a frivolous attempt to extort money from our community by making false claims about our property boundaries. Mrs. Mitchell is facing significant financial difficulties and is trying to manufacture a crisis to force us into an expensive settlement." I stood up. "Mrs. Hensley, would you like to tell them about the mineral rights survey you filed 3 months before my grandmother died? Or should I?" Margaret's face went from white to red. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Michael opened his folder and pulled out a stack of documents. According to the records we've obtained from the State Geological Survey Office, Meadowbrook Holdings filed a claim for mineral and water rights to this entire area in March of 2020. That was 3 months before Rose Mitchell passed away, and 5 months before they supposedly discovered that Crystal Lake might be available for development. The room erupted in confused conversations. Several people started asking questions at once, but Michael held up his hand for quiet. "There's more. The survey that shows Crystal Lake as part of the Lakewood Meadows development was backdated. The actual survey was conducted after the development was already under construction, but the paperwork was filed with dates that made it appear as though proper boundaries had been established before any building began." Richard Blackwood, Margaret's lawyer, jumped to his feet. "These are serious accusations and without proper evidence." "We have the evidence," I said, and my voice carried across the room like it was coming from 4 generations of Mitchell women who'd had enough of people trying to steal what was theirs. "We have the original homestead papers, the water rights certificates, the mineral rights claims, and, most importantly, we have documentation of every fraudulent filing you've made with the county." Michael pulled out a large rolled-up document and spread it across a table at the front of the room. "This is the original 1923 survey of the Mitchell Ranch. As you can see, the property boundaries extend to here, here, and here." He traced the lines with his finger, and I watched as the faces in the room began to understand what they were seeing. The community center where we were sitting was clearly marked as being within the original ranch boundaries. So was the main clubhouse. So was the swimming pool complex. So were 6 of the expensive homes that people in this room had paid $500,000 to own. "That's impossible," someone shouted from the back. "We have clear titles to our properties." "You have titles that are based on fraudulent surveys," Michael replied. "Which means your titles may not be worth the paper they're printed on." The room erupted again, but this time the anger wasn't directed at me. 50 homeowners who'd paid premium prices for their dream homes were suddenly realizing they might have been victims of the biggest real estate fraud in the county's history. Margaret was visibly panicking now, but she made one final attempt to regain control. "Even if there are some boundary discrepancies," she said, "we can resolve this through negotiation. There's no need for lawsuits or criminal charges. I'm sure we can reach an amicable agreement that protects everyone's interests." That's when I played my final card. "Mrs. Hensley, there's one more thing you should know. When my great-grandfather homesteaded this land in 1923, he discovered something at the bottom of Crystal Lake. Something that makes this property much more valuable than any of us realized." I could see the confusion and fear in her eyes, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." Michael smiled and pulled out the final document from his folder. According to the geological survey that was conducted as part of the original homestead claim, Crystal Lake sits on top of one of the largest natural spring systems in the state. The water rights alone are worth approximately $15 million at current market rates. The silence in the room was deafening. "But more than that," I continued, "the mineral rights survey shows significant deposits of limestone and quartzite beneath the ranch property. Mineral rights that were specifically reserved by the homestead grant and have never been sold or transferred." I looked directly at Margaret. "When you filed your fraudulent mineral rights claim, you weren't just trying to steal my lake? You were trying to steal deposits worth potentially $50 million. That's when Richard Blackwood made a run for the door. He didn't make it. Michael had anticipated this moment and had arranged for the county sheriff to be waiting outside. As Blackwood was being handcuffed and read his rights, Margaret finally cracked. "This is all his idea," she screamed. "He told us the Mitchell property was abandoned. He said the old woman didn't have proper documentation. He said we could claim it through adverse possession." It was over. In front of 50 witnesses, Margaret had just confessed to participating in a conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days later, when the county served eviction notices to Lakewood Meadows for all structures built on Mitchell Ranch property. The community center, where they'd held their meeting, was the first building to be demolished. 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch of my great-grandfather's original cabin, watching the sunrise paint Crystal Lake gold for the first time in 4 generations of Mitchell women. The legal battles had taken time to resolve, but justice had been swift and complete. Margaret Hensley was sentenced to 3 years in prison for real estate fraud and conspiracy. Richard Blackwood got 5 years for masterminding the scheme. Helen Vaughn, the property lawyer, lost her license and faced her own criminal charges. Meadowbrook Holdings, the parent company behind the development, was forced to pay nearly $12 million in restitution for building on stolen land. The money allowed me to restore the original ranch cabin, improve the property, and establish a trust fund that would ensure the Mitchell Ranch could never be threatened again. But the most poetic justice came in what happened to the Lakewood Meadows development itself. Margaret Fletcher was living in a house that violated every principle she was using to torment the rest of us. But it got better. The previous owners had been fighting these violations for years before selling to the Fletchers. The property had been stuck in legal limbo, with liens and code enforcement actions that should have prevented any sale from going through. Yet somehow, Margaret and Bruce had not only purchased the property, but had convinced the HOA board to retroactively approve all the violations as grandfathered non-conforming uses. Margaret hadn't just broken the rules, she'd bought her way out of them, then changed the system to make sure no one else could do the same. I photocopied everything. The original architectural guidelines, the violation notices from 2019 and 2020, the retroactive approval letter signed by the previous board, Margaret's own amendment proposals that had gradually given her dictatorial control over property sales. But I needed more than historical documents to stop her. I needed leverage. That's when I remembered something my neighbor Tom Brennan had mentioned in passing months earlier. Tom lived 2 houses down from me, a retired accountant who kept to himself but seemed to notice everything that happened in the neighborhood. I found him that evening, watering his tomato plants in the fading light. "Tom, you got a minute?" He looked up from his garden hose, squinting at me over his reading glasses. "Sure, David. How are you holding up?" "Not great, to be honest. Margaret Fletcher's been making my life hell over the house sale." Tom's expression darkened. "Margaret Fletcher." He said her name like he was describing a particularly unpleasant medical procedure. "That woman's been a plague on this neighborhood since the day she arrived. You mentioned something once about her having problems when she moved in." "What did you mean?" Tom glanced around as if Margaret might be hiding in his rose bushes, then motioned for me to follow him onto his back porch, where we couldn't be overheard. "David, what I'm about to tell you could cause a lot of trouble if it gets back to the wrong people." "I'm already in trouble, Tom. I don't think it can get much worse." He sat down heavily in an old patio chair, suddenly looking every bit of his 78 years. "Margaret Fletcher didn't just move to Pine Ridge. She fled here." "Fled?" "Bruce worked for a company called Heritage Financial Services down in Jacksonville. Investment management, retirement planning, that sort of thing. Well-respected firm, been around for decades." Tom paused, choosing his words carefully. "Until they weren't." I settled into the chair across from him, sensing this was going to be important. "Bruce was the senior partner when they got caught in some kind of securities fraud investigation. I don't know all the details, but from what I heard through mutual friends, the firm was managing retirement accounts for teachers and government employees. Supposedly safe, conservative investments. Let me guess, they weren't. Bruce had been funneling client money into high-risk investments without disclosure. When the market turned south in 2020, most of their clients lost everything. We're talking about teachers who'd been saving for 30 years, suddenly finding out their retirement accounts were worth pennies on the dollar. I felt my stomach drop. How many people? Over 300 families. The investigation went on for months. Bruce claimed he was just following company policy, that he didn't know the investments were inappropriate. Claimed he was just as much a victim as everyone else. But you don't believe that? Tom shook his head grimly. Bruce Fletcher wasn't some junior employee following orders. He was the senior partner. He knew exactly what he was doing. And Margaret. Tom's voice trailed off. What about Margaret? Margaret was the one who moved all their assets into offshore accounts 6 months before the investigation became public. Somehow, they managed to liquidate everything and disappear before the authorities could freeze their accounts. The pieces were falling into place, so they moved here to hide. Pine Ridge was perfect for them. Small community, low profile, cash purchase, so no mortgage company would run background checks. They could live quietly and wait for the statute of limitations to run out on any civil suits. But why take over the HOA? Tom's laugh was bitter. Control, David. People like Margaret Fletcher need to control their environment. They can't just live quietly, they have to dominate. And what better way to make sure no one asks uncomfortable questions about your past than to become the person in charge of asking questions about everyone else? That night, I sat in my living room, surrounded by documents and legal pads, covered with notes, trying to process everything I'd learned. Margaret Fletcher wasn't just a controlling neighbor. She was a criminal who'd stolen hundreds of retirement accounts and was now using HOA power to protect herself from scrutiny. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. And even if I could prove it, I wasn't sure it would help me sell my house and escape Pine Ridge. What I needed was a plan that would neutralize Margaret's power over my property sale, while ensuring she faced consequences for what she'd done to those teachers and retirees in Jacksonville. As I stared out at the lake where Sarah and I had dreamed of growing old together, an idea began to form. It was audacious, probably crazy, and would require perfect timing. But it just might work. The question was, did I have the courage to risk everything on one desperate gamble? Looking at the memorial bench where I'd scattered Sarah's ashes just 6 months earlier, I heard her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. David, sometimes the only way out is through. It was time to go through Margaret Fletcher like a hurricane. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for Thursday evening, September 15th, in the community center's main hall. Margaret had sent the notice to all residents with her usual theatrical flair: URGENT community standards, violation hearing property owner David Chen, attendance mandatory for all residents. She wanted an audience for my public humiliation. She was going to get one, just not the kind she was expecting. I spent 3 days preparing for that meeting like a lawyer preparing for the case of his life. I contacted Janet Morrison's real estate attorney friend, a sharp woman named Patricia Volkov, who specialized in HOA disputes. I gathered every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence I'd collected about Margaret's illegal power grab and the Fletchers' fraudulent past. Most importantly, I made a phone call to Jacksonville. Detective Ray Carruthers, with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Economic Crimes Unit, had been very interested to learn that Bruce and Margaret Fletcher were alive and well and living under their real names in Pine Ridge. The securities fraud case had never been closed, and several civil suits were still pending, waiting for the Fletchers to surface. Mr. Chen, Detective Carruthers had said over the phone, "We've been looking for the Fletchers for 3 years. If you can keep them in place for another week, we can have warrants ready to go." "I don't think that'll be a problem," I'd replied, thinking about Margaret's ego and her need to publicly destroy anyone who challenged her authority. Thursday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth and an approaching thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the tension building in Pine Ridge. By 7 p.m., the community center was packed. Margaret had indeed succeeded in drawing a crowd the largest HOA meeting attendance in the community's history. Margaret sat at the head table with the other 2 board members, looking like a judge preparing to hand down a death sentence. She dressed for the occasion in a severe black suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. "This meeting will come to order," she announced, banging a small gavel she'd acquired from somewhere. "We are here tonight to address the ongoing violations and non-compliance of property owner David Chen, who has repeatedly refused to follow established community standards and procedures." I sat in the front row, calm and ready. Patricia Volkov sat beside me, her laptop open and her legal documents organized in neat stacks. Behind us, the residents of Pine Ridge filled every chair and lined the walls. I could feel their eyes on me, some sympathetic, others curious, a few openly hostile. Margaret launched into her presentation with the enthusiasm of a prosecutor seeking the death penalty. She detailed every citation she'd issued, every fine I'd supposedly incurred, every way I'd allegedly violated the sacred covenants of Pine Ridge. "Mr. Chen has shown blatant disregard for our community standards," she declared, her voice rising with righteous indignation. His unauthorized attempt to sell his property without proper board approval threatens the very foundation of what makes Pine Ridge special. His violations of landscaping requirements, architectural guidelines, and commercial activity restrictions demonstrate a pattern of willful non-compliance that cannot be tolerated. She went on for 20 minutes, painting me as a dangerous radical who threatened to destroy property values and community harmony. Several residents nodded along, caught up in her performance. Finally, she turned to me with a smile that would have made a shark proud. "Mr. Chen, you have 5 minutes to explain yourself before this board votes on a resolution to place a line on your property and pursue legal action to enforce community standards." I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in that room. Sarah's voice whispered in my memory, "David, sometimes the only way out is through." "Thank you, Margaret," I began, my voice steady and calm. "Before I address your specific accusations, I think it's important that everyone in this room understands exactly what kind of person has been making these rules we're all supposed to follow." Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Chen, that's not relevant to it." "Oh, it's very relevant." I turned to face the crowd. "How many of you know that Margaret and Bruce Fletcher are fugitives from justice?" The room erupted. Margaret banged her gavel furiously. "That's completely out of order. Security violations and personal attacks." "Are you denying it, Margaret?" I pulled out the first document Patricia handed me. This is a civil complaint filed in Duval County, Florida, in March 2021. Fletcher versus Heritage Financial Services and Bruce Fletcher individually. One of 47 similar complaints filed by retirees whose life savings were stolen by Bruce Fletcher's investment fraud scheme. Margaret had gone pale. Bruce, sitting in the third row, was trying to make himself invisible. "This is character assassination," Margaret shouted. "These allegations have nothing to do with HOA governance." "Don't they?" I pulled out the next document. "This is the property record for your house, Margaret. The same house that violates height restrictions, coverage limits, and architectural guidelines that existed when you purchased it. The same violations you've been citing other residents for." I turned back to the crowd. Margaret Fletcher bought her way out of HOA violations, then changed the rules to make sure no one else could do the same. She's been using HOA authority to control who can buy and sell property in this community, not to protect property values, but to protect herself from the kind of scrutiny that might lead people to ask uncomfortable questions about where she got the money to buy $1 million house with cash. The room was dead silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. Margaret stood up behind the head table, her face flushed with rage. "These are lies. Defamation. I'll sue you for every penny." "With what money, Margaret? The money you stole from teachers' retirement accounts? Or maybe the money you hid in offshore accounts before fleeing Florida?" That's when Patricia Volkov stood up and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Patricia Volkov, and I represent Mr. Chen in this matter. What Mr. Chen has told you tonight is all documented and verifiable. The HOA board's actions regarding his property sale are not only illegal, they're part of a pattern of abuse of power that has been used to protect criminals from justice." She handed out copies of documents to the residents in the front row. These are the original Pine Ridge covenants from 1987 before Mrs. Fletcher changed them. These are the violations on the Fletcher property that were retroactively approved. And these are the legal documents showing the fraud investigation that the Fletchers fled to avoid. Margaret was losing control completely now. This is a conspiracy? A witch hunt? You can't just make accusations without proof. That's when Detective Carruthers walked into the community center. He'd been waiting outside, as we'd planned. The timing was perfect. Margaret turned to see a tall, serious-looking man in a suit walking down the center aisle, badge clearly visible on his belt. Mrs. Fletcher? Mrs. Margaret Fletcher? Detective Carruthers's voice carried easily through the silent room. Margaret seemed to shrink before our eyes. Who's asking? Detective Ray Carruthers, Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Mrs. Fletcher, I have warrants for the arrest of you and your husband Bruce Fletcher in connection with securities fraud and elder abuse charges filed in Duval County, Florida. The room exploded into chaos. People were standing, talking, shouting questions. Margaret was backing toward the exit, her face white as paper. Bruce was already trying to slip out the back door. You have the right to remain silent, Detective Carruthers continued, moving toward Margaret with calm professionalism. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. But I wasn't watching Margaret anymore. I was looking around the room at my neighbors, people I'd lived alongside for 15 years, people who'd been manipulated and controlled by a criminal who'd been using HOA power to hide from justice. Tom Brennan caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small nod of approval. Janet Morrison, who'd been sitting in the back, was grinning from ear to ear. Even some of the residents who'd seemed hostile earlier were looking at me with something approaching respect. As the police led Margaret and Bruce Fletcher away in handcuffs, the community center fell into an odd, almost peaceful quiet. People were still talking, but in hushed, shocked tones. The other two board members, both of whom had been Margaret's rubber stamps, were huddled together looking lost and confused. Patricia Volkov stood up and addressed the room one final time. Under the circumstances, I believe it's safe to say that all HOA actions taken under Mrs. Fletcher's leadership are now subject to legal review. Mr. Chen's property sale will proceed without further interference. Later that night, as the storm that had been threatening all evening finally arrived with dramatic lightning and cleansing rain, I sat on my porch watching the water cascade off my roof and into Sarah's garden. The for sale sign was still standing in my front yard, no longer a symbol of defeat but of victory. My phone rang. It was Emma, my daughter. Dad, I just saw the news online. Something about arrests in your HOA? Are you okay? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. What happened? I looked out at the lake, where Sarah and I had spent so many peaceful evenings, where we'd planned a future that cancer had stolen from us. But Margaret Fletcher hadn't been able to steal this place from me, and neither had her threats or her illegal power games. I learned something your mother always tried to teach me, I told Emma. Sometimes the only way out is through. But the story wasn't over yet. Because 3 days later, something happened that I never could have anticipated, something that would turn my victory into the sweetest revenge imaginable. The call came on Sunday morning while I was having coffee on my porch and reading about Margaret and Bruce Fletcher's arrest in the local newspaper. The headline read, "Pine Ridge HOA Leaders Arrested in Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud Scheme." Below it was a photo of Margaret in handcuffs, looking nothing like the imperious queen who terrorized our neighborhood for 3 years. Mr. Chen? The voice on the phone was crisp and professional. This is Helen Vasquez with Coastal Properties Management. I represent the estate sale division of Fletcher Holdings, LLC. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. I'm sorry, what? I'm calling regarding the Fletcher property at 1247 Lakeside Drive in Pine Ridge. We understand you may be interested in purchasing the home. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Margaret Fletcher's house, the Grand Colonial, from which she'd ruled over Pine Ridge like a dictator, was for sale? How is that possible? Helen Vasquez's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher's assets are being liquidated to pay restitution to the victims of their fraud scheme. The court has ordered an immediate sale of all real property. Given your recent interactions with the previous owners, We thought you might appreciate the first opportunity to make an offer." I sat there in Sarah's rocking chair, staring out at the lake, trying to process what I was hearing. Margaret Fletcher's house was being sold to compensate the teachers and retirees whose life savings she and Bruce had stolen. "When can I see it?" "This afternoon, if you're available." The Fletcher house was even more impressive on the inside than I'd imagined. 2,400 square feet of gleaming hardwood floors, granite countertops, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the entire lake. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet bigger than my current living room. The deck where Margaret had hosted her exclusive parties extended over the water on massive stone pillars. It was also built on multiple HOA violations that she'd retroact.